So, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. It's great to have you all here. I will just briefly introduce the Center for Experimental Practices, which is the host of this event, along with some support from University of the Arts Helsinki. I'm Ben Spatz. I'm the director of the Center for Experimental Practices, which is based in Huddersfield in Northern England. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that modern England owes its existence to ongoing extractive and neo-colonial relations around the world, and the rights of the people colonized by this country to live and work freely here and to participate in the determination of its future remain unceded. Center for Experimental Practices is a small research center. It's fairly new, and we are investigating experimental practices in a broad sense, but one of the things that we're primarily interested in is the politics of artistic research, again, in a broad sense, both within and outside of academia, and indeed as a contestation or a transformation or an experiment with the very form of academia itself and the form of the university. For more information about that, please visit our website, which I have just put in the chat, Center for Experimental Practices. You'll find there some information about some of our previous events, including some recordings from online seminars like this, which are now available for viewing. And I want to thank always Colin Frank, who is doing a lot of organizing and logistical work behind the scenes to enable these meetings and make them run smoothly. And I want to mention some future events. So this is the second event in the Whiteness and Sound Studies seminar series, which we're very excited to be hosting, and which is organized by Sofia, who was a former Ph.D. student at Huddersfield and a brilliant scholar and artist and practitioner. And I also just want to briefly mention that we will also be having another online seminar series coming up, which is the Lines of Flight seminar series that we do annually. And this year the theme is Lines of Flight, New Laboratories, and we'll be looking at different kinds of libraries on the edges of academia, both just inside and just outside those boundaries. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sophie to introduce our guest for this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Before we dive in, I'm just going to speak for a couple of minutes about the series, just to give a little bit of framing for the events and a little bit of background info about kind of where I'm coming from in curating this. So the main motivation here basically has to do with kind of critiquing and questioning certain premises that we work with that are kind of foundational to our work as artists and scholars, and to ask sort of how aspects of our concepts, techniques, aesthetics, and our artistic or pedagogical professional practices are rooted in whiteness and colonialism, and what we do about that. For me, the background of this inquiry has to do with many years that I spent in classical music education and practice as a singer, but in other areas as well. And just sort of realizing, as I started to think and write more critically about these disciplines, realizing how they sort of not only emerged from colonial context, but also kind of continue to be productive of racial difference. And that seems to be, to me, one of the key ways that whiteness operates in the arts. That you have this kind of history and this reproduction of racial difference, and then at the same time, like discussions about, empire, race, power, class. In some spaces, even gender is a little bit too much. So lately, I've been interested in how this plays out in more experimental areas, or areas that are traditionally sort of as avant-garde, areas where a lot of exciting stuff is happening and can happen, but also where maybe an air of the cutting edge kind of can mask the recirculation of certain old mechanisms. And that's something that I've been coming across as I kind of dug into the field of sound studies, and coming across a body of work that addressed the whiteness of the field, like both in terms of the global north focus of the scholarly canon, but also in terms of theories of the sonic derived from new materialism that tend to cast sound as this pre-social, pre-political phenomenon, and which sort of naturalize or universalize sound and homogenize the listening subject. And these are kind of the things that I wanted to bring some people together to discuss, people who are working in these fields as practitioners and scholars. And I wanted to center whiteness rather than, so to call this, you know, a Whiteness and Sound Studies series rather than a sort of decolonial listening or something like that, which it could easily have been. These framings overlap in many ways. But it was important to me to foreground whiteness because of the ways that it is so often overlooked with institutions, especially in institutional spaces, with institutions opting instead to like include diverse voices without doing any further self-critique. So I wanted to contribute to like another way of doing that. So with that, I am thrilled to introduce our speaker this evening. Budhaditya Chattopadhyay is a contemporary artist, researcher, writer, and theorist, working across diverse media such as sound, text, and moving image, and incorporating technologies including sensors, AI, and machine learning, and producing large-scale installations and live performances addressing urgent issues such as the climate crisis, human intervention in the environment, and ecology, migration, race, and decoloniality. Chattopadhyay's work inquires into lived experiences and considers the aspects of subjectivity, contemplation, mindfulness, and transcendence inherent in listening. He did numerous exhibitions, concerts, conferences, and festivals, such as Transmediale Berlin, Experimenta Biennale Grenoble, City Biennale Norway, ZKM Karlsruhe, and he completed his Ph.D. in artistic research and sound studies at Leiden University and is a visiting professor at the Critical Media Lab at the Academy of Art and Design in Basel, Switzerland, and a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Contemporary Art at the University of Bergen. So, Budhaditya, really happy to have you. It's all yours.
Thank you, Sophie, for the generous introduction. I'll talk from a very kind of personal position of kind of embodied knowledge that I have gathered over the years, 14, 15 years of being in Europe, trying to survive in a climate of oftentimes in which scholars, practitioners of color are marginalized, in kind of silencing that happens, and also in a social context, in everyday practices, how a body of a colored artist, social being treated in different contexts, social context, everyday contexts. So from that embodied sense of positionality, I'll talk and share some of the concerns, dividing this provocation whiteness into a number of strands, namely silencing non-white voices to breeding a lack of curiosity and ignorance, to the politics of canonization and sonic appropriation. These are different strands that I'll try to unpack in this talk. And I'll also share some of the works I have been doing in this field, organization like co-organizing, co-curating soundings in Berlin 2022, and few of my own artistic practices, which implicitly and explicitly address the questions that I'm trying to raise here. So in the slide, you see an opening at the House of Digital Art Mauritius, from where I just came back a few days ago, which is kind of fresh. And it's an opening, a picture taken just after the opening ceremony of the group exhibition called All Islands Are Trees at the House of Digital Art in Mauritius. Mauritius is an island nation, and the invocation in this title, All in Islands Are Trees, is to invite artists to speak about the intercontinental drift, the codependence and relationality of this region with other continents around, and kind of exchanges that took place historically. Not to mention that it was Glissant's idea of creolization is very much felt while I was in Mauritius, because this is the island nation that Glissant talks about in his, particularly in his work Poetics of Relation. Glissant fights against the notion of identity that are essentialist and reductionist in nature. In their place, he proposes ways to understand cultural formation that promote plurality. The idea of creolization weaves the fragmented pieces of migratory flux into a cultural fabric, which is emergent, which is continuously evolving, in a constant search for survival. Is the process of creolization that takes place in the lives of migratory people who, through slavery and through migration from one geography to the other. Over time, this fabric became Creole culture. And in Mauritius, when I was in Mauritius, I was feeling that sense of creolization because I read Glissant, and I was very curious to know how in situated context one can understand the process itself. So yeah, I was excited to engage with this hybrid nature of mixage, melange of people and cultures, and to explicate how creolization grew out of the experience of slavery. Glissant employs the relational concept of a rhizome, which is, it's kind of made well known in the work of Deleuze and Guattari. So I grew up with a sense of growing up in India, South Asia. There is always a sense of creolization in other kinds of creolization, mixtures, hybridity, and mixing between cultures, and having a completely cultural mix and mash in everyday practice, as well as in thinking of color. Different colors of people are living side by side and sharing every day. So for me, when it comes to sound and discussing decoloniality, creolization, I often come back to this concept of relationality, which is, of course, part of the creolization theory by Glissant, the relational dynamics of sound as a medium, a phenomenon, or event. So sound travels from one body to the other and from one geography to another. On its paths, it makes a myriad of connections. An utterance connects a voice to its listener based on their manifold positionalities, and thus knowledge is shared in a society. This social capacity of listening is significant when we think of sound in terms of the intricacies of communication and engaging in everyday contexts, emanating from situated positionalities and enhancing capacities to connect and build a relational world. Recently, Peruvian scholar Marisol de la Cadena suggested in a talk that there is no singular world or many discrete worlds. There are only connections and relations. Resonating with these relational dynamics and potentialities embedded in co-sounding and co-listening is the idea of creolization, which is, as I already mentioned, proposed by decolonial theorist and poet Edouard Glissant. I can also kind of tease you with the idea of how a mix of different things may taste or sound like. One of my favorite dishes is mixed lentils, how different ingredients, different kinds of lentils of different color come together to create a palette that is very tasteful. And just one ingredient doesn't make a dish adding taste. So, and from there, I grew up with like one of the first earliest songs that I heard was Black or White by Michael Jackson. I can share that song with you. It's very, very powerful. The song that I first heard and heard many times. And this Jackson's anti-racial campaign was rooted in a sense of pluralism, as you can resonate with the song with kind of immediate effect. And the kind of sense of plurivocality and pluriversality that often appears as an ideal worldling. And that sense of worlding I grew up with, and that was completely shattered when I moved to Europe. And my skin color appeared to be a disruption in very many social contexts. And if I focus on one particular aspect of that disruption is in the field of academia that I entered when I moved to Europe 14 years ago. It is not rare to be overheard in a socially shared space in Europe or in the West. I'm also thinking about the voice before I delve into the visibly different approach to my entrance into the field of sound studies and the kind of silence I felt that I didn't have any voice for many years. I just remain on the receiving end of marginalization, silencing, act of silencing in the field. Many of you might not understand until and unless you yourself go through that process, which oftentimes are very subtle and very, very appearing or acting on a subconscious level. And that sense of in the last 5-6 years, particularly the Black Lives Matter movement galvanized the world in 2020 and 2021. That was the watershed moment when I felt like I have something to share. I have a voice, and that voice I use to talk about my own positionality in this conundrum. And that is sounding otherwise. My voice, my accent on a material level might appear different from many of the accents, but the kind of rhetoric that I bring to the table and the discussion, the discourse, the kind of perspectives and worldviews, impulses that I bring that appear to be disruptive to the field, and that I understood by gaining a voice, gaining an agency, so to speak. And in the West, in Europe, I encountered the binaries that exist and that they are formed and nurtured and imposed on the societal fluxes. The binaries of West, non-West, white, non-white, global North, global South kind of binaries, and kind of creating difference in between them as an operating force to not only relegate many societies, communities from entering the main discourses, but also to marginalize and strip their voices off. And that is rooted in whiteness and Eurocentrism, oftentimes kind of based on the superiority complex of the West and the white Western society. And that is the root of racism that we may or may not know. Those who know very well by being the victim in everyday and in different degrees, from on the shop to on the bus stand to in the academic corridors to in many kind of situations. And those who go through the racist attitudes in different degrees, they know it so much better than the others who do not go through them. So I can talk from very honest positionality that there are hundreds, millions of examples or experiences that I have had the last 15 years, that in 1 hour I cannot share all, but I share a few perspectives. What kind of approaches, attitudes, and knowledge structures they build racism in society, and in a narrower field of the society is in academia, in the field of sound studies, so to speak. Just one example, yesterday I came across this CD in a library. It's a library, it's a CD made from a chant based on a conversation between Albert Einstein and Rabindranath Tagore. If you don't know Tagore, Tagore was one of the earliest or the first non-white, non-European who received Nobel Prize. Getting Nobel Prize is not that important, but what is important here is a conversation, historical conversation between Einstein and Tagore that many researchers come back to when we think of East-West or global North, global South kind of conversation or relationality. And that conversation was made into a composition. And I found this CD in the library. But what I found is that the library sticker was pasted on Tagore's face, not on Einstein's face. And I saw other CDs in which that library sticker was placed on the bottom, on the left side, or anywhere else, apart from the faces shown on the CD. So I was kind of struck by their approach that they could dare to place the sticker on the face of Tagore, but not on Einstein. So this is racism. This is a kind of like, very subtle, subconscious level. This kind of racial practices are normalized in everyday scenarios, and they often happen subconsciously without much conscious discussion about that. So they often happens through, on a level that is normalized and in everyday practice considered standard or normal. But this is not normal. This is, is just one example. Yesterday, I was standing in a bus stop and the bus appeared before me. So I was running to get the bus and the door closed in front of me. Then I was waiting there. Another bus came, which was not bringing me to the destination. Another person who was a white who came, and the door, when they asked for opening the door opened for them. So the bus could open or close door based on who is standing there. So these kind of everyday scenarios, everyday practices are normalized, and they only those who go through them, they understand what kind of humiliation one feels, and what kind of silencing and marginalization one feels in an embodied sense. It's an embodied experience, not looking at outside as an example, but I'm going through that process myself in every day, more or less every day in different degrees. So I'll focus on the degree of the academic scenario. The first example or the first trend I'll discuss is the silencing of non-white voices. And that is a sonic autoethnography that I kind of approach I take. It is not rare to be overheard in a socially shared space in Europe or in any part of the Western world. For example, in a flight or inside a train compartment, when you speak in a foreign language, this act of overhearing is often born out of suspicion and fear of the unknown. In the American context, 20 long years have passed since the notorious 9/11 occurred. Yet, someone speaking aloud in Arabic or Urdu may cause cabin crews to turn and report, or fellow passengers complain, even today. In Europe too, speaking in another semantic sound in social situations would attract cold attention of the locals and the technocratic grace of the surveillance cameras. It is usual for sounding otherwise to be unwelcome in the Western society. If we take a narrower social field of music and sound studies as a case scenario and compassionately consider how non-Western and non-white scholars and artists are treated even amid the trendy decolonial buzz of today, perhaps a depressing and demoralizing reality will unfold from the subjective position of the marginal section of societies, the immigrant and diasporic communities living a peripheral life of exile and unintegration. Being an immigrant practitioner and researcher from South Asia, working in Europe for the last 15 years, I can frankly say from my personal experiences that the road has been extremely bumpy. And it was rare to find an accommodating environment in the academia, inside institutional and scholarly corridors, and in a broader European society for people like us who speak perhaps in a different pitch and tone, although aspire to contribute to the canon. But more often than not, the canon refuses to accept my kind of voices perceived to be sounding otherwise. In an ideal conversation, if you think of the ideal conversation, listening and speaking are in equilibrium. One who speaks may aspire to be a good listener too. An equitable relationship between the listener and speaker nurtures exchanges and consolidates the communication. Likewise, a lack of such equity results in conflict, tension, and misunderstanding. As philosopher Gemma Kuradi-Fiumara suggests in her book, The Other Side of Language, A Philosophy of Listening. If we think that idea, that sense of the agency of listening in everyday practice and communication, sharing, we can expand that notion into kind of in a planetary scale. If we think of the binaries, global north-south, which is problematic, but which also brings us to the global dialogue on a planetary scale, thinking of, let's say, South Asia, of course, who's South? Europe, South. South Asia and Europe, or Africa and Europe, the conversations, the exchanges, the historical exchanges that transpired. In that historical context, the historical conversations between the so-called global norths and global souths, or the east and the west, often lacked equilibrium. Scholars of globalization, coloniality, and migration pointed out how Europe's relation with what it thought as its other were now and then fraught with tension and misunderstanding through imperial and colonial intentionality. These profoundly imbalanced conversations were ingrained in the colonially built hierarchies and extractive power structures that chose to ignore the possibility of reciprocal exchanges. If we narrow our critical and scholarly attention to the field of sound and music, there have been numerous encounters, and I'll share some of them in the next session, in the next strand, the third, the sonic appropriation. If we narrow, there are numerous encounters, but the two-way communication fell through the labyrinthian corridors of power and colonial violence. The West hardly listened carefully to the East and Souths, but never hesitated to take them for granted. I feel, as a person of color in European academia, I always is taken for granted. I just exist without a voice. This is a rare occasion that a voice is given to me to share my concerns, but this kind of scenarios are quite rare, even today in 2024. There are many instances of cultural appropriation from the East through an unequal distribution of knowledge, with little interest in the differences, auditory cultural specificities, acoustic territorialities, and the potential of sonic confluences. Or if we borrow the Glisson idea of creolization and Marie's Sol's idea of relationality, we can develop this idea of confluence. So to counter this difference, to counter this segregation of ideas and voices and perspectives, one can think of a confluence in which non-hierarchical, horizontal mode of engagement can generate different constellations. And these are the constellations that I'm trying to foreground in this talk. African-American composer George Lewis. Now, before I do that discuss this confluence kind of constellations, one needs to also think of gaining or achieving a voice, having a voice, and also achieving a sense of non-hierarchical model. And that model can be reached if we provincialize. Dipesh Chakraborty's work, Provincializing Europe, is based on this idea of how Europe's sense of universalizing its knowledge was provincial, and to kind of underline that provincialism. African-American composer George Lewis also talks about provincializing. He differentiated between urological and aprological methodologies in musicking and sound making, based on the listening perspectives and differences in cultural practices. This distinction was made to provincialize the field of music and sonic arts, acknowledging the historical interactions and confluences, but also to resist Europe's unabashed entitlement to universalizing knowledge, despite discouraging non-Western participation in its production. The distinction likewise helped to listen to global Souths. I add S, I talk about that later, that plurality of global South is not just one entity, one umbrella under which all the regions who decolonize themselves gather, but it's a plural entity and constellation of regions and cultures that can be understood as a vibrant, dynamic space of discussion. The global Souths with an S. So global Souths may have participation from Africa, South Asia, Latin Americas, and their rich auditory cultures, sonic practices, and knowledge systems that were often left on the margin of sonic discourses through a select canonization of the field that claimed to be universal, but was essentially Eurocentric. In Dipesh Chakraborty's writing, we also find critique of this Eurocentrism, calling for a provincialization of Europe, sizing down its superiority complex within a regional context. Today, if we think of now, in the last few years, in the sphere of sound and music practices, research and curation, a diverse community of practitioners and researchers are trying to make their voices heard across the globe, but developing an inclusive and equitable exchange of sound and listening, critically engaging with global South's sound practitioners, artists, and thinkers has not yet been attempted, largely remaining underexplored and yet dominated by Eurocentric views, whitewashed view methods, and monolithic ideas of listening. The works that are regularly discussed in sonic research and canonized in the global communities of sound and music researchers by the sheer volume of sheer volume of citations and reviews have a negligible number of contributions from the global South or from the diasporic or indigenous artists and thinkers. And I'll point out this lack of participation and representation from Global South knowledge systems, their artists and thinkers and literatures. They don't take part in the citation canonization process in the field of sound studies. So I'll talk about few of the examples I have encountered myself in regards to this lack of representation, silencing, and marginalization of perspectives and voices. Recently, the editors of a well-read journal publishing sonic studies turned down my request to review my first scholarly book published by a reputed university publisher. These journal editors, all male and white, informed me that they will not review my book, but did not provide any explanation. Upon further request, they aggressively gave a rather lame excuse, accusing the book being not original enough, questioning its scholarly integrity, and threatened me to keep the correspondence private. I contacted the publisher, who informed me that such statements are baseless, as my manuscript had gone through many stages of scrutiny, including at least 3 double-blind external peer reviews and internal reviews by the series editors before being deemed publishable. The publisher's decision to accept my manuscript took 2 long reviewing years, but ultimately the acceptance afforded a first-time author like me, outsider to the European fortress, deep joy and validation. These ill-intentioned journal editors hardly had the right to take that joy away from me with their murky positions. What were their intentions to silence me with a privileged affordance to do so without a conscience? Why were they dead against my book reach a critical assessment in the body of work by white privileged scholars considered canons in the field? Were these journal editors afraid to let me enter a territory they maintained as sacred, meant only for white scholars or a privileged class of scholars? In my article, Canonization and the Color of Sound Studies, I have pointed out how the politics of such canonization, and I'll talk about that later, politics of such canonizations are based on silencing and erasure of non-Western thoughts while privileging whiteness, and how they are born out of and catering to the deeply racial colonial structures of oppression and discrimination in European societies and its academic institutions. Given the deep time of self-scrutiny the Western worlds must be going through after the Black Lives Matter movement erupted and galvanized the globe since 2020, the positions and actions of these white male editors seem to be regressive and untimely. Untimely, indeed. The sheer baselessness of their accusatory position is nothing less than an act of silencing, but such acts are out of place and time when Western institutions and academia woke up from a slumber to be aware, to some degree, to some extent, of the inequalities and colonial structures embedded in their systemic oppressions, systems of oppression. But that unthinkable is happening even now, and these editors still live a privileged life of unquestioned entitlement, which their snug ignorance does not allow them to unpack. In another incident, a well-used media and communication studies European mailing list showed reluctance to announce my book in their list when I got in touch with their admin. This kind of gatekeeping is certainly not based on an equal access to what is considered canon. Taking a condescending attitude towards anything that is outside of the normative structures and sounds. Needless to say, here normative is rigidly associated with white privileged research and literature. Sometimes, of course, to some extent, and via a controlled inclusion, a few non-white and non-Western voices are allowed to enter the normative, but they are often born out of tokenism, hardly carrying deeper curiosity and sincere interest in their scholarship, area of investigation, and their specific voices of research. These few inclusions are also agenda-based. For example, focusing on women's identified researchers of color. These discriminatory and tokenist selections are not based on an equitable critical engagement with the original research of people of colors, but their agendas are set on ticking the boxes to satisfy, for example, the funding bodies and showing that they are diverse, quote unquote. These parochial tendencies based manifest in the canonization of scholarship by brutally excluding the BIPOC scholars from citations, references, and other modes of critical engagement. Just a recent example, the publications of the above-mentioned journal editors on universal subjects often do not feature any scholar of color in their citation and references, though there is no dearth of writings. It's not that there is a lack of writing, but there is a lack of interest and curiosity to recognize their efforts. Is it a conscious attempt to deny the people of color an overdue critical engagement and recognizing their places in academia? Alas, this lack of openness cuts these journal editors off from a rapidly changing world. And mind you, a rapidly changing world without being aware of it. They stand at the wrong side of history and will only be remembered, if ever, for their ample mediocrity and for their antagonistic positions of entitlement to silencing, but not for their academic contribution. Safeguarding their critical interest within a grossly drawn white margin limits their privileged cocoon from growth. Their inert complacency remains stuck in an incestuous whiteness of episteme that is already on the verge of collapse, along with their gatekeepers and supporters. So this is an embodied experience that I shared with you. And of course, you can understand the kind of emotional association one can have sharing those experiences, but they are normalized. You just think about the normalization that takes place in everyday scenarios, in everyday life, in everyday practice. Sharing these personal experiences reveal how voices of the otherwise speakers are often kept outside of the privileged centers and white clubs, and how such untoward acts of silencing are normalized. Complicit to these normalizations of oppressions are those who do not question the system and its enablers, and those who project as supporters of equality on social media but do not take any real action. How can they allow the gross underrepresentation, epistemic violence, and inequality to persist by allying with a protectionist regime? How can they not take a step to question the lingering acts of perpetrations of such unfair practices? Prove that the problem is structural and deep-rooted. Mere name dropping of trendy and mouthful terms like diversity and decolonization will not be enough to unsettle the cozy chairs of these provincial and conservative figures in the position of power, currently threatened by the belated rise of the subalterns in a global canon. The reactionary act of the journal editors is based on such fear and loathing. I'm sorry to say that. In an article published in Sounding Out in 2008, 2018 canonization and the color of sound studies, I shared the concerns, and of course, in the last 6 years, the situation have changed. For example, there are a number of publications in which scholars are included, but often, as I mentioned, through a kind of tokenist approach to diversify the publications and the canon itself. But I would try to show how the canon itself is yet to be diversified and how it's often close to voices of the others. In a keynote given at the Media Artistic Conference in 2015 in Montreal, the chief curator of Centre Pompidou Paris proclaimed that sound as an artistic medium and scholarly field will come to the foreground the next 10 years and occupy a central position in the contemporary arts and media scholarship. Indeed, within arts and humanities, sound studies has established itself as a vibrant and productive academic field, and we all know how in the last 10 years or 20 years, a profusion of scholarly and artistic works emerged, including numerous publications, conferences, and major research projects. 3 consecutive compendia, such as the Routledge Sound Studies Reader 2012, the Oxford Handbook of Sound Studies 2013, and the Routledge Companion to Sound Studies 2018, Keywords in Sound 2015, have been complemented with Journal of Sonic Studies, the new soundtrack, and a number of other peer-reviewed journals that are exclusively dedicated to the studies of sound. As you all know here, the first slide I shared, the sound arts too have gained currency in contemporary art since several major exhibitions were held in the last decades, such as Soundings in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. These publications, projects, and public events established sound arts and sound studies as fertile interdisciplinary fields of immense significance, receiving wider curatorial and academic attention. And that develop a canonical body of works and thoughts. In this sounding canon, even this book, Remapping Sound Studies, which claim to give kind of rare attention to the Global South, even the contribution in this book, if we think of contribution from the Global South scholars themselves, the actual embodied knowledge systems that they carry, the people of color, there is no participation, maybe one. So let's measure, have a mathematical measurement of how many contributions from the Global South and people of color. In this sounding canon, however, an astounding absence of Global South's thinkers, artists, and practitioners is observed. So these slides that I shared, there is only 2 contribution. 5 slides, 5 edited volumes, 2 contribution from person of color. That's just 2%. Academic journals and intellectual platforms that support sonic discourses, such as the Journal of Sonic Studies, publish almost no reviews of books or monographs written by non-Western scholars. No, 0. Just 2% and 0 in the journal publication in terms of celebrating or giving attention to a new book or publication that come up, and what kind of critical engagement a journal can do by reviewing the book. So these publications often show little or no interest in critically engaging with the artists and scholars of color and their work. even though they contribute, try to contribute to the discourse through free labor. The predominant scholarly and curatorial attention is invested in promoting and studying sounds from Euro-American media cultural contexts, sound in South Asia, sound practices and thoughts, knowledge systems in South Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, broadly termed the Global South, have largely remained underexplored, although they contribute significantly to global outputs in audiovisual media. For example, South Asia is the largest region, the producer of film and media content. Does that mean non-Europeans cannot think critically in the realm of sound and listening? If we make an effort in assessing some of the literatures and aesthetic experiences in sound and listening in South Asia alone, we find a different narrative. There are important treatises existing in South Asia alone, such as Dhwani theory, and rasa systems of knowledge, which influence composers like John Cage and La Monte Young historically. They had potential not only to enrich, but also radically reconfigure the field and address some unresolved areas in sonic research on themes of temporality, subjectivity, and technology studies. That is why early figures in sound practice, such as John Cage and La Monte Young, changed the course of their artistic trajectories to redefine sound practices in the West upon engaging with sonic approaches and thoughts from South Asia. I'll share a few of the examples. Despite these prominent figures in the Western canon, such as Cage, Young, Philip Glass, and Terry Reilly, borrowing ideas from South Asian sonic practices and ways of listening, these practices and knowledge systems have rarely been part of the dominant Eurocentric discourses in music and sound studies. For example, biographer of John Cage revealed that he underwent a composer's block in the 1940s and was going through a lack of enthusiasm for public presentations. His compositions were not appreciated by the audience. Likewise, he became disillusioned with communicating his art in public. He had a lack of enthusiasm for composing as well. He stated in an interview, quote, "Frequently, I misunderstood what another composer was saying simply because I had little understanding of his language. And I found other people misunderstanding what I myself was saying when I was saying something pointed and direct." Unquote. Fortunately, in the middle of this phase in 1946, Cage met Geeta Sarafai, an Indian musician who came to the United States and who was concerned about Western influence on the music of South Asia. Sarafai wanted to spend a few months in America studying Western music and meeting its composers. After the meeting, she started lessons in counterpoint and contemporary music with Cage, while she taught him about Indian music and sounds as a friendly gesture. There was a wonderful exchange, friendly exchange of thoughts, knowledges, perspectives, worldviews. Through Sarafai, Cage became acquainted with Indian music and its sonic aesthetics and philosophy. According to Sarafai's gurus in India, the purpose of music and performing sound was to sober and quieten the mind, thus rendering it susceptible to divine interventions, opening a composition for chance and contingency. This definition, underscoring the ephemeral quality of sound, became one of the central philosophies of Cage's views on music henceforth, and his listening and art in general impacting his subsequent works. Simultaneously, most likely through Sarabhai, Cage also began studying South Asian art historian Ananda Kumaraswamy's works and read through some of his published writings. Among the ideas that attracted Cage was rasa and the subjective states of permanent emotions, central to the rasa theory. According to this theory, as elaborated in the seminal epic Natyashastra, a monumental work by scholar Bharata, these emotions are divided into the navarasas or 9 emotions. The ninth of the navarasas is santam or tranquility, a state that is suggested to be associated with the role of music. In the treatise, it was considered that the purpose of music and art was to quieten the mind, freeing it from ego, and thus rendering it open to mystical experiences. These ideas transmitted through Sarabhai resonated very much with Cage, particularly in its moment of composer's block, and helped him come out of this block. Drawing ideas from South Asian sound worlds and their aesthetic knowledge systems, Cage eventually developed a new style of performative music based on the ideas of indeterminacy, whereby certain compositional elements such as duration, tempo, and other musical dynamics were kept open for chance events to happen. This approach already existed for many years in the music and sonic traditions in South Asia, such as Drupad and Khyal performances. And it was also practiced in everyday listening. But this was a novel intervention in Western sound worlds dominated by written scores. And this intervention was at the heart of the genesis of what we know today, the sounding arts, as hard in the way it developed through Cage's body of work with a new sense of temporality and spatiality. For example, in 4 minutes 33 seconds, which was central to developing a sensibility, ambient sensibility. Besides John Cage, other canonical figures in the field of sound, music, and sound arts were deeply influenced by South Asian sound practices and thoughts, particularly the Buddhist philosophical thoughts and ways of listening. To name just a few, Pauline Oliveros, Ilian Radig, Terry Reilly, Marion Zazila, who recently passed away, and Lamont Young. Lamont Young studied under Indian sound practitioner Pandit Prananath in the slide for 30 years, which fundamentally reshaped his sonic world, especially in the formation of the American minimalist school of music with a signature fascination for the Tanpura drone sounds. Lamont Young heard the sound of a Tanpura drone and was captivated by it when he encountered music from India for the first time. In the article, Lord of the Drone, journalist Alexander Keep noted that this first hearing of the sound of the Tanpura drone from the other world, a typical accompaniment in South Asian court music, had a dramatic impact on the young composer, who heard in it the ground on which to build organized sounds around sustained tones and a sublimated, slowed down rhythm. It was an inception that would change the course of his career and many others' career as well. It was also the conception moment of minimalist music as we know it today. As Lamont Young took a personal sonic journey, he needed a teacher or a guru. In Buddhism, it is said that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. He eventually met Pandit Prananath, and as I said earlier, became his disciple for next 30 years. And he was profoundly influenced by his style of singing, using the deep microtonal grains of the voice and the drone of the tanpura. In the slide, you see Lamontiang and Marianne Zazila are playing the tanpuras, weaving these tones together to form cascading textures suspended in time, like in the Dhrupad genre. Monty Young's borrowing of Indian classical music into minimalist sonic and compositional work were not very engaging to listeners trained in ragas and their sounds, sounding more like cultural appropriation. In the highly celebrated Fluxus anthology, Young's Dream House is included as a seminal and canonical work, although to a South Asian, it sounds awfully distorted and as an unready amateurish exercise on South Asian music. One critic writes, Young's voice sounds alien and yet somehow wrenchingly human with intakes of breath, tiny imperfections, audible effort. I started to feel drugged and overwhelmed and roughly handled, plied with disturbing visions and physical effects. It did not fail to occur to me that what I had heard might have been the product of some gross act of appropriation. But it just seemed so odd, so disinterested in pleasing me or anyone else. If this is appropriation, its motives were obscure. It's a very harsh review of Dreamhouse, which is considered a canonical work in the body of Fluxus, in the field of art, but to a trained ears, it sound awfully distorted and felt like a cultural sonic appropriation. However, such efforts found a canonical position in the West, leading Brian Eno to term Lamont Young as the daddy of us all. Monty Young indeed made a rupture in the history of Western music and sonic trajectories by using microtonality and minimalist approaches. And this minimalism arguably paved the way for prominent trajectories of so-called sound art or sonic arts or sounding arts to emerge, particularly in the West, because as I'll argue, sound art as a field is a very, very Western dominated field. Um, if you go to Africa or South Asia, nobody knows what sound art is. It also needs to be provincialized. So sound art emerged in the West through these encounters, clearly through these encounters in the next decades, from the time of Lamont Young encountering a drone, particularly through textural exploration of drone and ambient aesthetics, such as in the ways in which Brian Eno read Young, the proclaimed father of ambient music. In retrospect, if one critically delves into the phenomenon of intercultural sonic confluence I mentioned earlier, the primary influences behind Lamont Young's minimalism are revealed as his teacher Prananath, Indian music, and South Asian sonic traditions transmuted into appropriated forms of Fluxus works for naive Western audiences, regardless of whatever seminal status it reached. Few people know about the thoughts and conceptualizations of the sound practitioners who taught Lamont Young for 30 years. How many of the scholars know about Pandit Prananath or critically engaged with his body of work? But of course, we all know Monty Young and Marianne Zazila. All the credits of pioneering sound arts and ambient music go to Brian Eno and his father figure Lamont Young in the written histories of experimental music and sound arts, while sound studies flourish. Pandit Prananath-like figures remain mythical, mystical, esoteric, and epistemologically inert in the Western canon, obscured by a lack of critical, scientific, and cultural engagement with their work. This is the problem, isn't it? While Cage and Lamontiang are considered canonical figures in the birth of sound arts, Prananath and Gita Sarabhai remain obtruse presences. Their contributions to this important history has never received a thorough assessment, despite South Asian sonic ideas and concepts being frequently borrowed in the West to expand its canonical palette, let alone the Beatles' fever for Indian music in the hippie era. If due attention were given to such moments of intercultural and sonic confluences, new insights in sound studies could be revealed. Because of this lack of scholarly engagement, several pertinent issues remained unresolved in sound studies, as well as in the sound arts studies and practices, namely the ideas of time, subjectivity, and position of the self, and the histories of resistance to colonialism in listening cultures. Is it known to Western audiences that Gita Sarabhai made the first soundscape composition, the way we understand it, in 1967 for the Montreal Fair, much ahead of Murray Schafer's usage of the method in 1977? 10 years ago, 10 years before Murray Schafer termed soundscape composition, Gita Sarabhai, the one I showed in the slides, already composed the first soundscape composition. But very little scholarship is attending to these works by people of color. These questions may productively complicate and reconfigure the state of the arts in sound studies if given enough attention. They may aspire to break new grounds by bringing sound thinking from the global south to Eurocentric sound studies. They call for developing a potentially decolonial intervention by examining the transcultural confluences in sound media. This works against the colonial mode of hegemonic othering of sonic cultures and listening approaches manifested by blocking them from entering sonic studies, and a safely guarded, as I shared earlier, safely guarded, privileged field of knowledge production in the colonially built structures of Western universities, funding bodies, festivals, cultural institutions, and the epistemic systems themselves. The decolonial polemic I'm trying to inject lies in advocating for an equitable field by generating a curiosity towards manifold practices of listening outside of the European fortress and sound making, and the allied critical thinking around sonorous living, building communities, and relationality in the global souths and across the planet. The aim is to duly acknowledge the contributions of the people of color through a critical engagement with their work. So the historical specificities and differences needs to be approached to arrive, as I mentioned earlier, of a field which is equitable and reciprocal. And that sense of non-hierarchical platform can be understood through comprehensively engage with the marginalized voices to form an equal sonic exchange and confluence. But the field of sound studies, so to speak, has been breeding a lack of curiosity and ignorance. For example, the regions and cultures of South Asia and Southeast Asia traditionally nurtured a measure of time. If we think about one among many important issues in the studies of sound, time and temporality, or another spatiality, another subjectivity and the position of the self. If we unpack some of the knowledge systems dealing with the sense of time, measure of time. In South Asia, on Southeast Asia, time is not a linear one and is not dependent on the entity of logic and matter, but rather tended to imagine a metaphysical world with a profound respect for natural and ethereal divinities. Likewise, the rituals, ceremonies, and community practices are developed in constant communication with spirits and deities to whom the sound makers and musicians dedicated their performances in order to maintain an equilibrium with nature. In these cultures, time was recorded less in writing, such as written score or on recorded media, but more understood as a natural phenomenon. Time-based media, such as sound and music, were perceived as ephemeral, with an ineffable quality that needed to be left open-ended in their everyday cognition, and that needed to be disseminated outdoors in natural settings during their performances. In comparison, if we compare post-Enlightenment European listening approaches, preferred a linear curve of fixed compositional and listening time, consumed inside insular compared to the outdoor settings, an insular auditorium and concert halls as settings or territories estranged from the natural one. In Sonic Flux, Sound, Art and Metaphysics, sound art scholar Christoph Cox differentiated between distinct sonic temporalities of the East and West. The Western listening approaches mark a narrative temporal framework of beginnings, middles, and endings, which he relates to the classical musical composition and performance culture based on a concept of temporality that runs through the musical works enmeshed with European modernity. In this context, organized sounds attempt to hegemonize time's elusive flow by making it a measured, closed dramaturgy that follows a linear, climax-driven narrative. Understandably, this musical temporality was a thoroughly anthropocentric conception of time, one that accords with the utilitarian, logical, and scientific traditions of the West that conceive of time as linear, progressive, and aimed at accelerated developments. This sense of time and space permeates in colonial models of understanding the world, enabling a hegemonic and extractive relationship with the so-called non-West. On the other hand, concepts of time in the East or in many parts of the global South's listening cultures are circuitous, digressive, and improvisational. This approach manifests in the traditional ways of storytelling, rituals, songs, and folk music, and in the performances of court music, devotional music, and sounds. So these historical demarcations and differences need to be located, comprehended, and respected to create an equitable premise of global exchange, planetary exchanges and auditory interactions of a planetary scale towards an equitable dialogue and a possible sonic confluence. The artists and thinkers from the global South, me being one of them, many of whom are in constant interaction with the European institutions, festivals, funding bodies, but universities, conferences, and cultural organizations in their post-global mobilities as representatives of immigrant and diasporic communities of Europe and persons of color need to locate these tendencies in their work to self-determine and advance decolonial struggles. Only then their work will achieve liberation from the colonial chains and clutches that constantly demand adhering to monolithic ways of listening to time, space, and territories through dehumanization, Europeanization, whitewashing, exoticization, erasure, and cultural cleansings. Once this self-determination is achieved, equal sounds can be found in planetary conversations. So I'll wrap up my talk in 5 more minutes, if it's okay, Sophie?
Yeah, that's fine.
So I shared with you in kind of emotive tone my personal positionality and what I um, aim to do, kind of intervene in this field, and what are the impulses that drive me to continue even at the face of gross marginalization that I have been facing since last 15 years, and the uh, kind of confidence that grows, and the confidence that let me have my voice and share my concerns, and the kind of ideal worldling that I shared growing up with the songs of Michael Jackson, in which he disrupts this sense of binaries to bring a world which is continuously reciprocal to each other, different regions and territories, cultures, and in the work of the scholars like Glisson, Walter Mignolo, Ronaldo Vasquez, who talks about developing this relationality in a more concrete academic context, and developing a sense of acoustic common. This is what I resonate with. So when we think of the acts of silencing and marginalization I shared so much, the embodied experience of such naked acts of silencing and marginalization and enduring such violence during a large part of my nomadic life in Europe were perhaps at the core of my personal motivation to conceptualize and taking steps to realize soundings, and developing organization called Sound Across, which is a public platform and a global forum that explores the themes of democracy, equity, and environment in the sonic discourse across borders and cultures. It took part, was central to the Listening Biennale that I have co-curated in 2021. And also the soundings, which I invite you to have a little bit of listening in the time left.
And I'm here in order to attend the soundings gathering and to listen to start with.
I'm here to teach and perform my traditional Turkish music. I also hold a violin recital. I'm playing violin in traditional Turkish music style.
Why am I here? Curiosity. I think I was curious because I've not really experienced the South Global and a symposium of this sort, basically.
Well, at first it was a very interesting topic to me, because something like a symposium dedicated to sound I'm more into music, which music is sound, but I believe sound is way beyond the music. So I came with a very open mind to see something new, to hear something new, to know something new about.
I think I'm here to elicit change and give voice to those that are marginalised.
It's an opportunity to discuss relevant issues, very important issues, and share concerns and hear how other people also view those problems that I see in our discipline of music, but also in music as an art.
The idea was to create an anti-festival and conference kind of an assembly where everything is not as structured as we know how conferences in the West or festivals in the West are organized in general. And
one feeling that we had was that we never get far enough in our conversations because we always start from square one, right? We go to a new institution, ask again, so what do you think we should do, and what could be or the radio station says, what should Western music do to decolonize? And you always start from zero and then go a certain distance, and then you stop because that's the end of the interview, or that's the end of the conversation. And so what I felt, and we all felt together, I think, was that we needed a venue to go further.
In the morning, we gathered. We made listening silent keynote through listening to like self-reflective listening, noting down what he thought around a question that we meditated on, and then we shared it in a collective format. So it was like empowering our knowledge through finding resonances in our own thought, and then sharing it collectively with each other to finding like a collaborative spirit. Maybe some conflict, some resonating with, but ultimately it's a collective knowledge that was formed by sharing.
We are redefining who we are, So I rather use the word the global fluidity, and that covers everything.
I think it's important to qualify what we mean when we use the term. I think the global south for me, even though it doesn't have the S, is a plural shared subjugation in it, in of itself. So I think there's some sort of responsibility we have to also take. So just using terms flippantly.
That there is other forms, and I don't want to use other, I want to use exist alternative forms, and this is, I think, the part of decoloniality is just like to think that there is no otherness. It's just that there is other forms of other worlds exist and has been existing there.
So that was the beginning of the day. After lunch, we go deeper into practice through different knowledge that we can transmit from who know. I think we can stop here I think it's time to maybe have a more conversational approach to what we are discussing here.
Thank you.
Is it a good time, Sophie, to just take a pause?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you so much. That was so fascinating, that symposium. I can just open straight up to questions. If somebody wants to jump in, I have thoughts of my own, but I could leave a little space here, let somebody else jump in first. If you'd like to ask a question, you can just go for it. You don't need, there's no process. I can just share a thought of mine, which was about, I really like that interviewee who was talking about needing a venue to go further, and the the frustration of sort of the limit of how deep the conversation can go when we're working in this kind of, you know, freelance kind of way or project-based way. I think probably a lot of people really resonate with that. And I was thinking just in relation also before when you were earlier in your talk, I was thinking about that question in relation to the university specifically. And how we kind of deal with that institution. And just the different sort of set of possibilities, right? Like we can go out and create our kind of communities and set up our own para institutions or collectivities, which most of the time always anyway depend on some sort of structure, right? Some sort of funding structure or some other system that determines the extent of what we can do. And so I was just wondering what you think about the university, about the conversation that can go on there, and how you imagine the university being able or maybe not being able to accommodate what you're proposing and what, you know, is so necessary.
Yes, two things come to mind. Thanks for the invocation to think about where we belong, universities, and how we deal with everyday kind of structural, systemic approaches to, let's say, people of color and yeah. So I was thinking about the cancel culture. Recent phenomenon, or maybe earlier it appeared in many occasions, but recently in the festivals in Germany, Transmediale or CTM, I came across gross act of canceling culture. So one can approach or question cancel culture from two perspectives. One is that one method would be to boycott, to cancel, to not take part, to not participate in this kind of Western-dominated white spaces. Universities are one. Or we can say that we don't work in universities. We go out, we cancel or opt out of our positions, funded positions. This is one. Of course, this is respectable. It takes courage to cancel. It takes courage to not take an opportunity to, you know, some like your funding or your positions. And the other method is what Walter Migloro suggests, that the universities act like the central bodies in which coloniality unfolds, to exist in this system and try to reconfigure through subversive means, acts of subversion and transgression, through your body of work, artistic, conceptual, theoretical interventions you make, so that it collectively advances a mode of subversive, transgressive generation of knowledge, which are oftentimes marginalized. So this is the second method or approach or attitude that I resonate with. I exist in the system, but I don't negate my participation, but I take the participation as a mode to turn it upside down, to have a voice and use this voice to share my concerns. And I think ultimately, maybe the cancel culture can sustain itself if it can, but I think being part of the system and trying to change it from the within is something we can think of when we respond to the questions like what we do in the institutional structures in universities, in funding bodies, in festivals, conferences, which are all carrying these impulses of segregation, of marginalization, of silencing. There's a systematic in their structures. But how to deal with that? By trying to help it change from within.
Thank you.
I have a question. Hello.
Go ahead. Hi.
Hello, my name is Laura, or Laura, as you want to pronounce it. I have a question regarding like any interactions that you may have with people that are not inside the academic field or represented by any institution. How do you go about like maybe, I don't know, having an act of consciousness about like this imbalance and how if you are trying to maybe bring in certain knowledge that it's not in academia, how do you deal with this? Basically, I don't know if I made myself, if I explained myself.
So you mean to say that a question whether outside of academia, these questions can be addressed? Yes, of course. I gave so many examples of everyday practices in which segregation and discriminations are made. To how to counter that, I think that to counter, you need to resist. If you accept what is being imposed on you, perhaps on the street, on a shop, in a organizational corridor, or any space outside of the gentrified space of the university, there the struggle is far more embodied, far more grounded and explicit, and that's everyday struggle is there. I personally, I can speak for myself, and perhaps that will resonate with many of us whose skin tone is different. I think that to resist, whenever I feel there is let's say, a attack or a kind of racialization that is happening, or a more subtle level, whenever that happens, I resist. I confront either the body or the figure or the collective or a community, a bus driver to a shop owner to a person on the street. I resist. If I don't resist, it will be normalized. You need to resist on the street. You need to have the courage to question the act of gross discrimination made without knowing, by part of a systematized approach and attitude towards people, or by a subconscious act of violence. So yeah, absolutely confronting them on site and immediately is the only way to make the systems aware of its biases and prejudices. And outside of academia, there is very little support. Even in academia, like I'm sitting in my office room, I might feel protected given the architectural support system. There are walls, there is a roof which protects me from, let's say, a rain or storm. But even within the constraints of this in a university office room, I don't feel safe oftentimes because of the encounters I constantly face. I make kind of my navigation through this system, through the academic knowledge corridors, by continuously resisting, continuously voicing the opinions,
Thank you. Just a quick question. Is the Soundings event or like symposium going to happen again? Are you planning to do it again?
This is question of funding. We got a funding in 2022. We might again think of having an edition 2 or 3, but it depends on funding, of course, and also collective effort on our end. One time happening is also impactful. If you think of the Arab Music Conference 32, what was instrumental in developing a sense of non-Western practices in sound and music studies. 1932, it happened only one time. Bandung Conference happened only one time in 1955. That currently gave birth to what is known as the Global South. So oftentimes, one-time occurrences, they are impactful. So it doesn't always need to have a repetition. So I may not claim that soundings will have such an impact, but it is an example of how alternative modes of gathering can nurture knowledge in a way that is not often part of the white European systems of gathering and kind of top-down approach. To counter that, we developed a bottom-up approach. We didn't have a program as such. We gathered and then something developed from there, mostly.
Thank you.
Are there any questions in the chat, Sophie?
I don't think so. No, I don't think people have been using the chat. But you're free to if you would like to, everybody, if that is better. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if people have questions, just please put them in the chat. We can read them out loud. Maybe while the questions are being asked, I can ask a question, and then I think some other questions might be putting into the chat. First, thank you so much for that talk. I mean, it was just really comprehensive, and I'm not in the field of music, so I just learned a huge amount. I guess I wanted to ask you kind of like about practical, this is a little bit of a vague question, but sort of practical, practice-based. This is your slide is your slide is a little bit answering my question. I was going to ask about practical, practical kind of technical elements in relation to the form of events, because I think one of the things that for me is kind of interesting and not totally resonant for me in the idea of sound studies is that separation of sound as this world that is, you know, the way it's kind of understood in a sensory sense is like sound, as if it's this thing that happens. And, you know, we know obviously that sound is grounded in practice in many different ways that you're very much talking about. But I think, you know, there's so much work on sort of musical ideas of like rhythm and pitch and all these kinds of things. And I'm really interested in the form of the event that generates these things and kind of how to, you know, it's easier to say than to do, to actually have an event that operates differently. I mean, for sure, I'd be curious to hear more about what you said just a moment ago, that you came together for soundings without a specific program and then a structure evolved. I feel like probably there's a lot of embodied knowledge that's implicit in that sentence, that structure just evolved, right? Because that doesn't always happen. So thinking about structuring of events, about bringing people together, about when there's a written program or not a written program, the also spaces, you were just talking about architecture a moment ago, like what kind of space do we gather in, those kinds of questions that are in between. They're sort of I think they're in between the everyday world that you were referring to of the bus stop and the street, and then the world of like sound as this thing that is in some way retroactively defined by what can be recorded. So about the structure of the event, like I would like to learn from you how you're thinking about gatherings and but also these things that you say on this slide, temporality, spatiality, chance control, subject, they can all be applied, but I would still love to hear you talk about that.
Yes, absolutely. I completely understand the problems associated with taking sound or observing sound as an object. And that's a scientific tradition of looking at sound, let's say from a telescope, the academic lens, that is a device through which you can actually, a microscope, through which you can observe sound like an object of observation. And to counter that observational study of sound as an object, one can counter that by focusing on listening. Rather than sound as an object, you can think of the process of listening. And in there, that shift can generate so many other kind of knowledge. For example, intersubjectivity, about the reception, about the processual development sound. And if we think of sound as an object, even when it is considered an object of study, sound is always spilling over any objecthood. Sound is continuously developing. I started with this sentence that sound is relational. And by that, I meant that sound is always moving around, creating connections, social relations. And based on your positionality, where you stand, you may stand in front of me today, I speak. You can also stand at the back of my body or outside of this room. And based on your positionality, you hear different things. You might, my voice might sound illegible. You cannot make sense of it if you are outside of the room. And if you are sitting in the sofa in front of my table, you can clearly hear me. So sound is not just that thing. Sound is based on where you position yourself. So listening is ultimately what we study, but we call it sound studies. We need to call it listening studies, because focusing on listening opens up so many dimensions of the processual development and engagement, participation, you know.
Thank you so much. That's great. Lots of things to say in response, but we have a few questions, so I'm just gonna should we maybe move to those?
I think we should. Can you? One of us should read the questions.
Yeah,
out loud.
Yeah, I'll do that. So the first one. All right, so how do we define non-Western or indigenous culture if we, according to Gisan, etc., acknowledge creolization, hybridity, etc., as an outcome of white domination, slavery, and settler colonialism? How do we delineate the boundaries of indigenous knowledge? When does knowledge that has been appropriated from colonial communities by dominated peoples become indigenous? If we try to appeal to a pure idea of indigeneity, are we not disempowering indigenous people by assuming that their culture is fixed rather than emergent? So, for example, what if linear time in music has become a part of certain syncretic forms that nonetheless index indigenous identities and knowledge systems? For example, South African jazz relies on the play between linear and circular time. It is nonetheless considered a folkloric music in the country, as are other choral forms associated with African iterations of Christianity. In other words, how do we manage the supposed contradiction between indigenous culture as fluid and emergent versus the need to empower previously marginalized aspects of indigenous culture that we perhaps imagine to be relatively codified?
Yes, what is indigenous? One can question. Of course, that's a very, very valid and important question. Like the indigeneity, the definition of indigenousness, indigeneity, and for that matter, definitions of tradition, definition of different forms of culture, global south. These are all kind of fixed ideas which are generated by looking at the other. The indigenous. The indigenous person would not call themselves indigenous, you know. It's just existing on the periphery. It's a particular worldview in which you participate without being aware about participation, and that sense of contribution you make to the world, the deities, the divinities, through, let's say, music and sound practices. I have been growing up in the tribal areas in India in my boyhood, and I have heard how the acoustic territory is created by how much you hear. So a sense of geography is developed through the listening that is possible, and the region outside of which you cannot hear doesn't exist. That sense of territorialization, not visual or cartographic, but sonic, is something very, very interesting to engage with. So indigenousness is not something that is imposed on a certain practice, but it is emergent and continuously evolving, and it doesn't call itself indigenous. It's just a way of looking at it from the outside that define it as indigenous. That is what the stream of thought generated in my mind in response to the long comment made here.
I'm going to go to the next question. I would really love to dwell on each one of these. So I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to. It's not because there's a lack of content, not at all. So the next question, you gave the examples of John Cage and Lamont Young as artists who may not have engaged quite ethically with the listening and sounding cultures of Indian musicians. Do you feel there is a need right now to decolonize and contemporize these concepts like rasa, as you mentioned, or Nad Brahman?
So my point was that there have been many instances of borrowing of ideas, and perhaps their intention was great to, of course, it's a natural tendency to learn from each experience we encounter. And if it is powerful enough to help you reconsider the artistic practices, methods, ways of listening, if that is impactful, it will bound to have an impact and reflect in the next work that is coming after this encounter. It's a natural to do that. But the question is, when it comes to writing that history, without giving a proper citation, so to speak, if we think of a scientific mode of writing, citation must be given, references must be made to the contributions, not posing John Cage and Lamont Young as genius composers and artists, but the kind of relationality that enabled them to exist, to change their trajectories of thinking and practices. So that relationality is something I'm talking about. I'm not thinking of posing Gita Sarabhai or Prananath as counter figures, but I'm trying to draw the attention to the relational dynamics of the emergence of John Cage's work. And that dynamism, that sense of contribution needs to be made. Not like the profound ignorance lies in Brian Eno's statement that Lamont Young is the daddy of us all, daddy of ambient sound. But ambient sound is not just that's not falling from the sky, it's a kind of sensibility that exists or coexist temporally for thousands of years in other cultures. If you just consider that as like the genius kind of formations that are problematic. That is what I'm trying to counter here.
In a way, it makes me think of the provincialization again, right? So it's kind of like the John Cage needs to be, or Lamont Young needs to be provincialized.
Yeah.
Okay, the last question we have here is, it was great to hear about Cage and Lamont Young's lineage, and the quote around appropriation felt very visceral. thinking about the canon, I was wondering if we might leave it like a toppled monument, interesting but misplaced, violent and grossly segregationist, and form another work for a history of music which is pluralist and inclusive.
Yeah, I feel like this is a comment, and it's a very wishful comment, and I think we all aspire to arrive at that point in which we are equally engaging with each other without having a system to tell us how to deal with others, how to deal with people of color, different accent, different ways to deal with existing systems, different modes of listening from the sense of time, space, territories, subjectivities. So that sense of reciprocity, if that is generative of our based on our conversations and conversations to open up to that generation of unfolding exchange between various voices and bodies, figures, territories. I consider that that's an ideal scenario that we all aspire for, if we aspire for something. My being here and speaking after a full day of teaching, I'm continuing to speak only because I'm motivated to arrive at that point in which I'm taken as someone as equal as the others, irrespective of skin tone and my ways of speaking, and irrespective of the background, cultural or national or religious or racial or color, whatever. That equity is something I personally would like to reach, like to arrive at. That's the becoming I envision or imagine or reimagine.
Well, we're at 10 o'clock in Helsinki. I don't know what everyone, where everyone else is at. Thank you so much, Budhaditya. It was really a wonderful couple of hours. It was a long day for me and I was tired at the start and I feel full of energy now. Thanks everyone for joining and for your great questions and comments and contributions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for being with us.